Madam President,
Senator from Oklahoma.
I ask unanimous consent that I be recognized as if in morning business for such time as I shall consume.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I'm here today to talk about an important vote that I took 19 years ago, a vote about free trade in China. Now, you might say I'm a little out of character coming down to the floor and talking about free trade in China, because normally I'm down here talking about how China is investing their military at unprecedented rates, or how they're passing us up in terms of our military, which we saw during the last administration. The reality is that when it comes to China, which is entirely controlled by a tyrannical communist party, you can't separate their trade behavior from their military like you can in a democratic government. China asserts its power both economically and militarily to the detriment of the free world. So 19 years ago, I came down to the Senate floor and took a stand against the tyrannical regime in China. The vote was on whether or not to allow Chinese government normalize trade relationships with the United States. That would pave the way for China to join the World Trade Organization. At that time, it wasn't popular for any member of the Senate who stood in the way of free trade agreements, to much less a Republican. But as I saw it then, the vote did much more than open up trade. It granted favors to an authoritarian regime despite their openly predatory actions, without demanding concessions in return. Now, my colleagues claim that opening China to free trade would cause China to change their behavior. Clearly, that didn't happen, but I'll get to that in a minute. Filled with the false hope of empty promises, the trade agreement sailed through the Senate 83-15 and was signed by then President Clinton. Now, I'm the only one of those 15 no votes still serving in the United States Senate. Today, 19 years later, we've seen the reality of what I thought would happen at the time, and I said, and I'm quoting now from my speech 19 years ago, "We cannot allow the pursuit of dollars to bind us to certain realities about ruling communist regime in China, including," now keep in mind, I'm going to read all 8 of these that I mentioned 19 years ago. "Repeated threats against the United States and Taiwan, still going on today. Massive military modernization and buildup, still going on. Proliferation of dangerous weapons to rogue states. Theft to U.S. nuclear secrets, still going on. Demonstrated strategy to exploit commercial relations to acquire advanced military technology. That's still going on today. Attempts to corrupt the U.S. political system. Violation of international agreements. Brutal repression of dissidents. We know that's happening." And I continued, quote, "To ignore these actions in the belief that they can be separated from what we do in our standing relations is dangerously misguided. China's trade surpluses are helping to finance the regime's military buildup and aggressive foreign policy while strengthening its hold on economic and political power." I don't take any pride in being right, because the outcome has been devastating for the American workers. China has stolen our technology and personnel secrets and taken millions of U.S. jobs over the past 2 decades. The facts show today. Let's go quickly through a few of what we predicted 2 decades ago and see where we are today. First, threats against the United States in Taiwan. That's pretty clear. Just look at China's reaction to a recent routine arms sale to Taiwan of tanks and Stinger missiles. Keep in mind, China has known since 1979 that we sell arms to Taiwan to aid in their self-defense. I bet everyone knows that. They threatened that they were prepared to go to war to defend their, quote, "unity and territorial integrity" over a routine arms sale. In the past year alone, Beijing has frequently threatened to use force against any who oppose the Communist Party's designs on Taiwan. So despite free trade, China has not stopped their threatening behavior toward the United States and Taiwan. Secondly, massive military modernization and the buildup. Well, we know that's still going on. It's obvious to everyone that China hasn't changed their behavior on this because of free trade. It's emboldened them. China has become more aggressive as our free trade system has subsidized their economy. Some key facts over the last decade: the Chinese government has grown their military spending. Now look at the chart here. When I read this, has grown their military spending by 83%. It's over the last decade. Meanwhile, during the first 5 years, or the last 5 years of the Obama administration, we decreased our military spending by 25%. Now, we decreased our military spending while China had increased theirs by 83%. And that's why today China is building naval ships at a faster rate than we are and is on pace to surpass the number of vessels by 2030. And that's why China is investing heavily in cyber capabilities, aviation, artillery, hypersonic weapons. Hypersonic weapons, that's the most sophisticated new weapons that they have, weapons that move at 5 times the speed of sound. And actually, before the Obama administration, we were ahead of both China and Russia. At the end of that administration, we're behind. And we're catching up now. Each capability, if not superior to ours, has the potential to do us significant harm. In 2018, I visited our allies in Southeast Asia, where I saw the Chinese military build up in the South China Seas for myself. You remember, Madam President, the islands that they created. This is not taking over territory, it's creating territory, because those islands weren't there. And they have islands in the South China Sea. The Chinese, I have the last count was, I believe, 7 islands, and they have the capability. Each one has a capability that when you go in and look at it, you become convinced that they're preparing for World War III. I also went to Djibouti, where I saw over the first international military base. And by the way, China, prior to that time, this is only 3 years ago, China had always done their military in their home territory. It's always been in China until they went in Djibouti, and that's in the northern part of Africa, and they started their own activity there. And now they're all the way down to Tanzania in that part of the world. The Department of Defense officials expect the Chinese to open more bases too in the Middle East, in China, in Southeast Asia, and in the Pacific, all strategically important locations. And when I talk to our allies in the Pacific, they are concerned, and many are beginning to hedge their bets because they see what China is doing. Now, we're talking about the South China Sea, and we're talking about our own allies and have historically been our allies, and all of a sudden they're starting to have second thoughts. They're seeing what China is doing, but don't see us doing anything. And after 8 years of President Obama's weak leadership, it's getting more difficult for us to prove to them that we're actually interested in standing up to China's aggression. The third, the theft of U.S. secrets. We know about that. There's no saying that what China doesn't have, it steals. That's even more apparent today than it was in 2000. China is still actively pursuing and stealing some of our most valuable military secrets. Just last year, China hacked a Navy contractor and stole massive amounts of classified data. That practice isn't new, but it's still having serious impacts on our ability to get ahead of China militarily. We're seeing an alarming rise in how China steals industrial secrets. They do it out in the open. For example, by forcing any American business who wants to operate in China to form a partnership with a Chinese business. They've been doing that for a long period of time, and we've been going along with it. Now, sadly, these partnerships are nothing more than a way for the Chinese Communist Party to access and steal proprietary ideas and technology. They also do it in nefarious ways, through exploiting educational relationships on college campuses or stealing biomedical research during the peer review process. Now, this is no small thing. 1 in 5 American companies have been victims of Chinese intellectual property theft. That means because nearly 80% of our economy is based on intangibles, the very things that the Chinese are stealing. So it's safe to say this is another area where the regime in Beijing has been emboldened by free trade at the expense of American innovation and economic growth. China hasn't changed its position on exploiting commercial and relationships either. For the past 2 decades, China has taken advantage of countries, weaponizing their debt and working to control ports, infrastructure, and other territory, posing a very real threat to United States interests. There's no place where this is more apparent than in Africa, where I keep hearing, quote, America will tell you what it needs, China will build it for you. Of course, they don't say that, they don't follow through and talk about how they use all Chinese resources to do this. They use Chinese labor, but of no value to Africa. And I've been in Africa probably more than any other member because I've been very active in that area and have seen some of the threats that face us in that continent. And I've seen the Chinese, what we refer to as debt trap, hobble more promising governments. But it goes far beyond the developing world and extends right into our own backyard. Just look at the recent issue with the NBA, where the general manager of the Houston Rockets tweeted a message in support of Hong Kong protesters. The backlash was swift. China stopped airing Rockets games or streaming them online, and their online retailers pulled merchandise from online stores. We also have seen the U.S. hotels, aviation companies, even the Gap, being forced to edit the self-censor to remove any reference that even tangentially refers to Taiwan, Tibet, or Hong Kong not being a part of the People's Republic of China, all to appease the Communist Party. Now, Tiffany's, the jewelry company, was pressured to remove an advertisement of a woman covering her eye because images of a protester in Hong Kong with a wounded eye got international attention. Now, we live in a democracy, and we don't dictate to private businesses what they should or should not do. This is not the case in China. Yet, if we continue down the road of self-censorship, the party's demands will escalate, and it will be harder and harder to exercise freedom of expression. And fourth, lastly, brutal repression of dissidents. That was true 19 years ago, and is true today. More than anything, I would like to say this was an area where free trade had forced the Chinese Communist Party to change its behavior. That's what we're all told would happen, but it didn't happen. We know it's not true. We all know the atrocities of what is going on in Xinjiang province, where the government is forcing the Muslim minority to concentration camps, although they call them re-education centers. We all know this is going on in Hong Kong, where Beijing is repressing a democratic demonstration with brutal tactics. I can remember being in Hong Kong at the time that China reasserted its what they called their leadership, their ownership to Hong Kong, and it's been on and off all these years. And right now, that effort, the disagreement is still taking place. And outside the areas of that, despite China's best efforts have attracted international attention, we still know about the atrocities the Chinese Communist Party quietly inflicts on journalists, Christian minorities, and house churches and in communities across China every day. Now, I've just painted a very bleak picture of U.S.-China relations and how unrestricted trade didn't force the ruling party in Beijing to change its behavior. But the good news is help is finally on its way. After the trade deal was enacted, I'm talking about the President Trump's trade deal. I kept speaking out against the Chinese Communist Party, calling attention to their human rights abuses, their military buildup, and their manipulative trade tactics, and their economic bullying. I pushed every president until now to stand up to the economic powerhouse before it was too late and they outmatched us. And I tried that with the Republicans and Democrats alike, and it didn't work. Now we have the first president since 2000 to take China seriously, President Trump. He's clear-eyed about the regime in Beijing. He knows that our trade relations has been unfair and imbalanced, and he understands that we need real and permanent fixes in order to have any long-term stability. I mean, this is something that's been going on for a long period of time, and he is now changing this. He's getting criticized, obviously. And I have to say this, it hurts our farmers in the state of Oklahoma. However, I would say that they are very understanding that someone is just willing to finally take on China. He has effectively applied tariffs, both to punish the Chinese government for its manipulative trade practices, but also to support critical industries in the United States. The result, China's economy slowed to its lowest point since 1992. And that's if you believe their official numbers. These are their numbers. It has slowed their economy down. This has not happened before. The economic pressure brought on them to table ready to make it a real deal, one that is fair and accountable. And so far, we've gotten phase one, a preliminary first deal, and our outcome is good for farmers in Oklahoma and across the country. For the first time, China has agreed to purchase 40 to 50 billion worth of American agricultural goods. Now, that would be the highest level since 2012, and that's a good start. The fight against China's economic manipulation and influence is not over, and it can't just be limited to shrinking the trade deficit through greater purchases of American goods. Future parts of any agreement need to be sure that to address the concerns the presidents of both parties neglected for decades, including theft of intellectual property and industrial secrets, forced technology transfers, reciprocal access to markets, and subsidies to China's state-owned enterprises. And all this needs to be placed into a proper context of the Communist Party's ambitions on the world stage to rewrite the rules of the international system, to make the world safe for authorities to suppress democracy and abuse human rights, and to achieve global minority superiority by mid-century. And President Trump's stand against China on trade has provoked a lot of discussion about our competition with China. We've got to remember that this is not a competition against China, but a competition for influence, the kind of influence that decides what kind of world our kids and grandkids are going to live in. You know, next week we'll be celebrating, my wife and I, our 60th wedding anniversary. We have 20 kids and grandkids, and they're the ones that would be living in that world that I just described. In this competition, we can't afford to be naive. The Chinese Communist Party has a very different version of the world it would like to create. So even as we keep talking about the tariffs, we have to remember that our values are still America's most precious commodity. And it is our values, free people and truly free markets, that must guide us in the competition ahead. Every part of the speech I gave on the Senate floor 19 years ago has become a reality, and President Trump knows this. Maybe we better listen to him. With that, I will yield the floor